Hello, my name is Father Jamie McMorrin, and I'm the parish administrator of the churches of St Margaret's, St Kentigern's, and St John's in Edinburgh. I'm also part of the Commission for Catechetics, and as you may have seen, we recently organised a day of formation and reflection to help us to prepare for the introduction of the new lectionary. This change means that when you hear the Bible read at Mass, you'll hear the same passages of Scripture, but the translation will be slightly different, changing from the Jerusalem Bible, with the JB, to the English Standard Version, the ESV. The talks from that day were recorded and are available on YouTube, so they're well worth checking out if you haven't done so already. My task on that day, in this video and in the Zoom series that will follow in Advent, is to put these two translations side by side and look very concretely at what will stay the same, what will change, and insofar as I can, what might be the reason. Because we're talking about translation, this will involve looking a little bit at the original languages, usually Hebrew in the case of the Old Testament and Greek in the case of the New Testament. And I'll try to make this as accessible as possible. What I hope we can do together is to take out our magnifying glasses and zoom in on some of the key words and phrases of the readings that we hear at Masses, and to mix a metaphor, to dig a bit deeper into the background of the biblical text. We'll put the two versions, the JB and the ESV, side by side, verse by verse, and compare them. Probably there'll be some cases where I, like you, will think, oh, I think I probably preferred the older version. And there'll be some cases where I, and hopefully you, will say, that helps me to understand this a little bit better, or to see it in a new way. On the whole, to put my cards on the table, I think I prefer the new translation. But if this change gets us reading the Bible and reflecting on it, and even, like the rabbis of old, passionately debating about it, then that will be no bad thing. So each week during Advent, I'm going to do an hour-long Zoom session, 15 minutes on the first reading of that Sunday, 15 minutes on the second reading, and 15 minutes on the Gospel, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. Today, to give you a quick taster of what I have in mind, I'm going to take a quick look at the Gospel that you will hear if you're at Mass this Friday on the Feast of All Saints, from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, verses 1 to 12. It's the start of what we know as the Sermon on the Mount, one of the 5 great sermons preached by Jesus in the Gospel, and we usually know them as the Beatitudes. It's a beautiful, poetic Gospel, rich in depth and in meaning. And for that reason, I'm not going to look at all 12 verses in this video. I'm actually only going to look at one word. But that word is the first word of this Sermon on the Mount in verse 3, and it's actually repeated 9 times in this short passage, and it gives the passage as a whole its structure. We might say that it's the key word of this key passage, and it's also the most obvious difference that you'll notice when this passage is read at Mass in future. As you can see, looking at the first Beatitude in verse 3, the two translations are very similar, but there's one notable difference. And the key word that we're going to look at today is highlighted in yellow on your screen. In the Jerusalem Bible, the word that's repeated is happy. Happy are the poor in spirit. Happy are those who mourn. Happy the gentle, and so on. In the ESV, the English Standard Version, that word happy is now changed to blessed. Now, these two words, happy and blessed, are not contradictory. They're not quite synonyms, exactly equivalent, but they do have something in common, don't they? You'd find them in the same aisle of the supermarket, as it were. But the emphasis is a bit different, isn't it? Happy, we might associate with a feeling or with a state of mind. The other, we might associate more with our relationship with God, in the sense of being fortunate or favoured by him in some way. So, which of these two did Jesus actually say? Of course, he didn't speak English, so he didn't say either. The Gospel of Matthew, like the rest of the New Testament, is written in Greek. And the word that Matthew used is makarios, in its plural form, actually, makarioi. And if you look up the Standard Dictionary of Biblical Greek, the BDAG, you would find makarios defined as blessed, fortunate, happy, usually in the sense of privileged recipient of divine favour. So you can see that both of those possibilities, blessed and happy, are correct. It may be that blessed, listed first, is a little bit closer to the original word, but happy isn't wrong. There's a possibility, I suppose, though, that happy might be misunderstood. What we're trying to get across is a deep spiritual happiness, not something merely superficial, but a deeper sense of contentment and spiritual fulfillment. And maybe blessed captures that a little bit better. Someone who is mourning, almost by definition, is not happy in the cheery, smiley sense, but they might be blessed by God, the recipient of God's special love and special grace, and in that way capable of being at peace, even in externally terrible circumstances. Now, this isn't the only place in the gospel that the word makarios appears. For example, at that crucial turning point in Matthew's gospel, Jesus says to Peter, "Blessed, makarios, are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." So found also at the end of John's gospel, when Jesus says to Thomas, "Thomas, you believe because you can see me. Makarioi, blessed are those who cannot see and yet believe." And then at the end of the book of Revelation, the very last book of the Bible, John says, "Makarioi are those who are invited to the wedding supper of the Lamb." Words familiar probably to all of us because we hear them at every Mass just before we receive Holy Communion. Now, some of you might be thinking, but when Jesus stood up on the mountain, was he speaking Greek? Surely as a pious Israelite, he would have spoken Hebrew, or perhaps that vernacular development of Hebrew, Aramaic. And of course, you'd be right. Whatever language Jesus spoke, though, there's no question that his mind, and Matthew's too, was formed and filled with the Hebrew scriptures. If the Greek word that Matthew gives us is makarios, we can make a pretty good guess at what the Hebrew word that would lie behind it would be. And that word is ashrei. Ashrei is a really important word. It's a wisdom word, and it's used repeatedly in the Hebrew Bible, especially in the book of Psalms and the book of Proverbs, as a guide to living a good life, a fulfilled life, or we might say a life of happy blessedness. The first word of the Sermon on the Mount is makarios, or blessed, and the first word of the book of Psalms is ashrei, or blessed. Ashrei, blessed is the man who follows not the counsel of the wicked. The first Psalm says that the path to a blessed, happy, deeply fulfilled life is to avoid sinners and instead to read the Bible. And when that first Psalm was translated into Greek a few centuries before the birth of Jesus, how did they translate that crucial first word of the first Psalm? You've guessed it, it's our old friend, makarios. Makarios is the man who follows not the counsel of the wicked. So, how do we come to know these words as the Beatitudes? Why don't we call them the Macaritudes or something like that? We know them as the Beatitudes because when in the 4th century AD, the Pope's secretary, St. Jerome, was trying to translate that Greek word makarios and that Hebrew word ashrei, not into English, but into Latin, the language of Western Christianity for almost a millennium, he was wrestling with exactly this same problem that we're wrestling with together today. And he chose the Latin word beatus, which means blessed, hence beatitude, beatus, beatitudes. Great early modern English Bibles, both Catholic and Reformed, translated this word. They also went for blessed. And actually, blessed is the majority mainstream choice used by almost every modern English translation of the Bible. Again, that's not to say that happy is wrong. Maybe that's a word that's more accessible, more immediately understandable. But the word blessed invites us to a new and deeper perspective and actually calls us back to a rich tradition of Bible translation and reflection. Makarios, ashrei, beatus, blessed.